Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give it a few seconds as people trickle in for our webinar this morning. Welcome to those who are already here. All right, I think we can get started. So good morning, everyone. My name is Fiona McDonald. I am the Events and Communications Lead for the Invasive Species Council of BC. My pronouns are she, her, and I am coming to you today from the traditional unceded and occupied territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. I'm very excited to have you all here today for First Aid for Pesticide Exposure. It's a very important topic, and I'm sure we will learn a lot from our presenter, Lisa Rybchuk. Before we begin, a few technical things just to make sure that you have the best experience on our webinar today. There is a chat box available for you to use. As I go over these tech check details, I welcome you to join us in the chat and let us know who you are and where you're joining from. Just make sure that you do click, there's a little to there, make sure it says to everyone and not just hosts and panelists. We do have some tech support today, so if you are having any technical difficulties, just pop it in the chat box and we'll help you out. There's also different ways to view your screen. We recommend we recommend side-by-side speaker. That button is up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And also, if you have any questions for our presenter today, you can see there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in there. There's also a pretty cool feature where you can upvote questions. If you see the one that you wanted to ask, but someone else has already asked it, you can vote it up to the top. And my last reminder is that today, this webinar is applicable for pesticide applicator credits, but there is a quiz at the end, and you do need to stay for the entire webinar, and you do need to take the quiz at the end. It's very straightforward. It's just on SurveyMonkey. It's 5 questions. It will take you no time at all. And all the answers will be in the presentation today. But please don't forget to do that quiz. We will pop it into the chat closer to the end of the presentation. And yeah, so finally, I'd like to introduce Gwen Shrimpton, the Executive Director of IVMA, who will introduce our presenter for us this morning.
Thank you, Fiona. This webinar is co-hosted by the Integrated Vegetation Management Association of BC and the Invasive Species Council of BC. The IVMA is a recognized organization dedicated to the responsible practice of vegetation management throughout the province. Our membership represents diverse industries including forestry, gas and electric utilities, railways and highways, and invasive plant management. The IVMA is the credit coordinator for the Ministry of Environment Continuing Education Program for the recertification of pesticide applicators for the forestry, industrial vegetation, including noxious weeds, and aerial categories. You must be a member of the IVMA for us to track your credits. Information on this program, as well as how to become a member of the IVMA, can be found on our website at ivma.com. We plan to enhance the opportunities for obtaining credits by holding these webinars. This webinar qualifies for 1 credit in British Columbia and 1 credit in Alberta. You must provide us with your pesticide applicator certificate number and stay for the entire presentation and answer the quiz at the end. You do not need to pass the quiz in order to obtain your credit. Please note that this webinar will not be available online through the e-learning center at the ISA for credits at a later date. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Lisa Rybchuk. Lisa is the owner-operator of Woodchuck Enterprises Limited, a vegetation management and safety training company operating near Carstairs, Alberta. As a licensed pesticide applicator, Lisa provides weed control services in landscape, industrial, forestry, and agricultural settings. She also teaches the authorized assistance course and provides tutorials for those preparing to write their pesticide applicator or commercial dispenser exams. In addition to pesticide-related training, Lisa is also a National Construction Safety Officer and a licensed safety instructor in first aid, H2S Alive, fall protection, confined space, and ground disturbance training. Welcome, Lisa.
Wow. Well, thank you for that, Gwen. I was going to note too that we have in Alberta the Professional Vegetation Managers Association, and I'm the president of that as well. So I know that some of the people that are members will also be attending this, and that it is broadcast for Alberta and BC. So that's wonderful. Yeah, so I've been doing this for quite a long time, obviously. That I started in 2004. So I think I'm coming up on my 18th, 19th season of spraying. But as you know, as sprayers in the spray season, we're very busy, but then the winter months can often be not so busy and have us looking for other opportunities to fill that time. So that's when I started pursuing safety. And that's what brought me to doing the first aid course. And now I've combined both of those passions to create this course on first aid for pesticide exposure. So I just wanted to stick in my disclaimer there just to say that this isn't a replacement for doing proper first aid training. This is just really an awareness course, just specifically directing it towards pesticides. So, and again, like if you're ever working with pesticides and you have a negative experience in terms of any exposure type symptoms, then certainly go get medical attention. Don't wait to try to remember what was covered in this course. You just go get the medical attention that you need or need for other people. So on that note, this is what I want to cover today. It's the some outlines of what to expect, the occupational health and safety, which sort of guides the practice. Then relative toxicity, kind of looking at different chemicals and how they compare to one another. And then those routes of exposure as far as what do we need to do to protect ourselves and others that are working in the pesticide environment, and then first aid responses that should someone be exposed to the pesticides, what would we actually do about it? So on that note, with the Occupational Health and Safety Act, this is that provincial legislation. Actually, it starts even at the federal level, but at the provincial level, you might be familiar with a book. This is the one that we have in Alberta. It would be similar to what you have in BC, but it's that your employer loves you and wants to keep you healthy and happy in the workplace. But not only that, they're actually legally required to do that. So they want to make sure that you are competent in the work that you do. And that's why you're here today. This is part of that competency training and keeping up with educational opportunities in terms of safety. So they want to make sure that you're aware of all of your responsibilities in the workplace, and that they're not just responsible for you, but all the workers and all the people who are present on that work site. And in exchange, as an employee, then we're responsible for protecting ourselves and following those rules that our employer has set in place. So in that, you're probably quite familiar with doing hazard assessments. It's a big part of our sort of, especially for industrial applicators, in assessing that work site. So it's required under the occupational health and safety that the employer, in cooperation with the employees, assesses the work site and identifies any potential hazards that are there. And so once they're identified, it's not just good enough to identify them. They need to actually make efforts to eliminate them. And if they can't eliminate them, then they need to control that hazard. So how do we do that? You may be familiar with this sort of upside down triangle, that we need to make efforts to eliminate that risk if we can. And so when it comes to spraying, sure, I mean, sometimes that's when they switch to mowing. They say, you know, we're not going to be doing the spraying, we're going to do hand pulling instead, or we'll do mowing instead. We eliminate the risk of spraying entirely. But so we've decided we're going to spray, that is our best opportunity. Then can we choose the least toxic chemical available? And so, you know, we're going to choose what is the best chemical for the situation, but can we substitute in the least toxic where possible? And then it comes to engineering controls of those things that are put in place that we don't need to do anything necessarily different. It's actually in place for us. So that would be in an enclosed cab for your sprayers, or is it having shrouded sprayers, that sort of thing, where it's covered so that the spray isn't as mobile in the air. And then we get down to administrative controls. These are somewhat less effective in terms of our hierarchy of controls, but certainly this is where our training comes in, our competency training, our safe work practices. These are things that we need to do to help to address the potential hazards of working with pesticides. And then lastly, as we know, the personal protective equipment is really the last resort. It's like, okay, we tried everything we could to have you not using pesticides and not being exposed, but ultimately we're still making that decision to send you out to work and using these pesticides. And so the best thing that they can do at that point is make sure that you're wearing personal protective equipment to ensure you're adequately protected from unnecessary exposure. So what does that mean in terms of what is that risk? And so the risk when it comes to pesticides is it's a function or factor of toxicity combined with exposure. So we can have a product that's really, really toxic, but if we limit our exposure to that product, then the risk is low. Conversely, we can have a product that's really quite low toxicity, but if we don't protect ourselves, we can have a high risk of exposure. So we look at balancing that. We can't change the toxicity factor. The toxicity is determined by the pesticide itself, and that is the chemical composition and formulation of that product. But what we can control is our exposure. So when we look at these toxicity factors, you're probably familiar with like LD50, LC50. That's the lethal dose that kills 50% of that test population. It's also measured in lethal concentration. So they use that. It's very similar. It's just that when they're dealing with lethal dose, they're talking about dermal or ingestion applications versus lethal concentration would be its concentration in air or in water. So the concentration of the active ingredient is what also determines its risk and its toxicity. And so when we're working with concentrated products, we may find that the precautions we need to take are higher, and when we're doing our mixing and loading than when they're actually diluted and we're working with them. And then again, that dose and length of exposure is a factor in that the higher the dose, the higher exposure, the greater the risk, the greater toxicity effects we might find. So this image is just a reference to that the dose makes the poison, and that we could have a particular exposure to, a grown adult that may not affect that adult, but it may affect the young or the ill or the old in a different way. So just keeping that in mind, and then even recognizing that there are individual sensitivities as well. That it may be that there's a group of people out there spraying and only one is affected, and you may think, well, really, is it that pesticide exposure that's causing these symptoms? And absolutely, it could be. We all have our own individual sensitivities. So pesticide toxicity, what exactly is it? It essentially is that harm that a pesticide can cause to an organism. But in that, we know we work with toxic products. That is the intent of using them, is to, control these weeds or control these insect pests. And that is the intent. Of course, we have our non-targets that we want to protect. So when it comes to toxicity, we can look at acute toxicity versus chronic toxicity. The acute is the short-term effects. So we may see that after just a single dose or small doses, but over a short period of time, versus chronic toxicity, that these poisoning symptoms are occurring months or years after exposure. It could be from a single dose over a long period, that we have effects over a long period of time, or these multiple smaller doses occurring over and over again that are giving chronic effects. What I want to point out here is that when it comes to first aid for pesticide exposure, we're talking about acute toxicity. how we're going to respond to the sudden effects of pesticide exposure. Versus chronic toxicity, if someone is having chronic symptoms, you're not providing first aid necessarily. You would send them to a doctor. They need to have a medical visit. So what does the LD50 really mean? So it's that measure of acute toxicity. It's expressed in terms of milligrams per kilogram of exposure. So it's that lethal dose that they take this chemical and they apply it, say, to this test population. It may be oral, maybe dermal, and we can get different LD50s based on how it was exposed to that test population. It's usually rats or mice, and they provide them. They apply this chemical and they continually apply more to the point that 50% of that test population dies. Then they go, okay, well, then that's the lethal dose. But they only look at death as a measure. So they don't look at other effects. And so we can't put too much weight into the LD50. It's strictly a way of comparing one chemical against another, these toxicities against another. It's not really a complete picture of how toxic a product is. So it doesn't look at chronic toxicity. It doesn't look at combined effects. It doesn't look at the formulated product. It's strictly looking at the active ingredient in that product. And this just says about the lethal concentration. Could be expressed as parts per million or parts per billion in air or water. Where we see that is like its effect on aquatic organisms when it's applied in water, for example. Here's one question for you. Do not answer it now. This is just a reminder. This is the type of question that there will be. So stick around for the whole presentation. At the end, there will be a link that you'll click on, and this is one of the questions. So would it be that is when we talk about toxicity, if we have, what's worse, a low lethal dose or a high lethal dose? Which is more toxic? So now looking at that relative toxicity, this is just some examples that I pulled together as far as what does relative toxicity mean? And it's just a way of comparing these different ingredients or different active ingredients. And when we look at them, you'll be, maybe be surprised that even water ranks on the list. It doesn't matter what it is. You can have toxic effects from virtually anything, including water. So to a very high degree, obviously, but 90,000 milligrams per kilogram is the lethal dose to kill 50% of the test population. But looking through that scale, even at the other end, we see caffeine at 200 milligrams per kilogram. Well, our body's ability to metabolize these products can also determine the active toxicity on our bodies. And also we'll see that even vitamins and things like that, things that our bodies need, including salt for that matter, our bodies need them. This isn't a list of all things toxic, therefore they're all bad for us. Some things are toxic, but we need them. They're necessary for our bodies. It's all the dose makes the poison. But also to note in here, we see like diazinon as an insecticide has a pretty low LD50. And so the lower the LD50, the greater the toxicity. In general, with insecticides, they are typically more toxic to us because we are more related to an insect than we are to plants. And so when we're using nerve poisons, well, those nerve poisons are going to affect us too, and we're going to have that higher level of toxicity versus when we're using herbicides that are attacking growing points on the plants. We don't have those growing points. We don't have those same enzymes, and so we're less likely to be affected by them. Having said that, we still see 2,4-diamine with an LD50 of 950. Malathion insecticide is there. Higher up on the scale, though, you'll see glyphosate herbicide at 5,600 milligrams per kilogram. And we tend to group anything over 5,000 as having a low level of toxicity. So the PMRA, Pest Management Regulatory Agency, requires that all of the products that we use have a reflection of the toxicity of that product on the labels. And so they take those LD50s and they convert that, they interpret that information from say on that chart there, it says acute LD50 of less than 500 milligrams per kilogram, it's going to get a rating in terms of that active ingredient is considered to be a danger poison. So we're going to see that danger poison symbol on that label. Then between that 500 to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram, we're going to see that warning poison on the label, and so on, that we'll see caution poison if it's 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams per kilogram. So sometimes we don't see a pictogram at all. Sometimes it's just words or nothing at all. It may just see, you know, this product could be a skin irritant or eye irritant. And so essentially anything over that 2,500 milligrams per kilogram won't earn, isn't considered toxic enough to earn a label like that, either caution, warning, or danger. However, that's only when they're talking about LD50s. You still may see a warning poison symbol on a product that doesn't have a low LD50, and it's that those labels on the actual product are a reflection of the formulated product, whereas the LD50 is strictly based on the active ingredient. So they take all this information and they make it as easy to find as possible. Like, where do we find how toxic a product is? We're just going to go straight to the label. They've made it as simple, easy to find, and able to be interpreted by anyone using the product to keep them safe. So where else might we go looking for this information would be on the SDS sheet. So chances are everybody has taken their WHMIS 2015 globally harmonized system training. And so it's required in the workplace for anyone that is working with pesticide or with any hazardous products. And so specific to this is that that we would be looking at section 4 for first aid measures, and at section 11 that talks about the toxicological information. And so that is where you would find those LD50s. So when you're wondering how toxic a product is, and in an emergency situation, you can go to that SDS sheet, but you will find the immediate information that you require will also be on the label. So the SDS sheet just provides additional information. It talks about spill cleanup. It talks about what to do in the event of a fire, that sort of thing. So we talked about the risk is equal to exposure times by the toxicity. So we talked about the toxicity, but what can we do to reduce our exposure? And so having the right attitude can go a long way to keeping you safe. And where I think of this is when it comes to like choosing a staff member, you know, choosing someone to work with when spraying, I'll choose the person who kind of has a bit of a healthy fear of chemicals, you know, a respectful attitude, as opposed to someone who is overconfident and maybe saying, oh, you know, this stuff, I would drink this stuff. And, you know, I think it's important to have a good, healthy consideration for the risks that we're working with and taking the necessary precautions. So we can make sure that we're using the right equipment, trying to reduce our exposure wherever possible. And then using the right protective equipment is using that personal protective equipment that is provided to us. And sometimes we even may need a higher level of protection because of the length of time that we're working with these pesticides. So keeping in mind the label will give you like the minimum personal protective equipment that you need to be using. But you may say, you know what, I work with this every day, all summer long. I'm going to step up that level of protection for myself and for my staff. And then lastly, following the right safety practices. I think of this too as being a good leader, be a good role model. Make sure that, you know, if you're sending your staff out to work with all this necessary personal protective equipment on, and then you go in to visit them and you're entering that area that the pesticide has been applied on, you have to wear that same level of personal protective equipment, even just to go and visit them, if it's still within that re-entry period. So how might we get exposed? So before we go spraying, there's things that we can do, like in terms of choosing the least toxic pesticide, that sometimes we'll find chemicals like maybe the, say 2,4-D, for example, the amine version of it is generally considered a less toxic version than the ester version of it. So maybe we can make those choices at that point, even before we even go spraying, is choosing the least toxic version and reading the label carefully. So then during spraying, of course, we're going to wear our personal protective equipment. We're going to use the safeguards that are built into the equipment, and then reducing our exposure by taking breaks while we're out there spraying, just to limit the continuous exposure that we have. And so then after spraying, just because you're done spraying doesn't mean that the risk is gone. We still need to remove our personal protective equipment at the end of the day. We need to wash our hands, and certainly washing your hands before you're eating or drinking or smoking. And also then when you get home, take a shower, or even if you can take a shower at the workplace, that can work as well in terms of removing your exposure to that pesticide as soon as possible. So how does it get into our bodies? Then we have these 4 main routes of exposure, of whether we're breathing it in, or whether it goes into our eyes, or whether it's on our skin, or whether we consume it. Important to note that the dermal exposure is actually the highest level of exposure. 90% of the exposure cases are from dermal. However, if one of the most important ones is through inhalation, that's one of the quickest ways that the pesticide gets into your bloodstream. And the problem is once it gets into the bloodstream, it's very difficult to remove, and that damage may be irreversible. So we're going to see that in terms of using high pressure products, ultra low volume fogging, working in enclosed spaces. Whenever we work with low droplet sizes, very fine droplet sizes, the risk of exposure through inhalation is greater than when we work with bigger droplet sizes. So we see this particularly when working with insecticides, where contact is so important that we deliberately use high pressure, fine droplet sizes to make good contact. As a result, pesticides are often requiring a higher level of respiratory protection to reduce that inhalation hazard. So wear the respirator. Certainly if it says you must wear it, then you must wear it. Even if it says avoid breathing these pesticide vapors, then you should consider wearing it, especially during mixing and loading. So of that respiratory protective equipment, you want to just make sure that you read the label and know what is the correct respirator to be using. So certainly dust masks are not going to be sufficient. Our N95 masks are not sufficient. And not only are they not sufficient for filtering out organic vapors, but they can actually absorb those chemicals. And if you continue to breathe with that mask on, then you can actually increase your level of exposure. So make sure that if it says to use a respirator, that you consult as to what type you should be using, and that you use the necessary cartridges that are for organic vapors. And if you are using one, make sure that it fits you properly, that you may need to be fit tested to make sure they do that negative pressure test to make sure that any air that you are breathing is directly being filtered and not seeping in through the edges of a poorly fitting mask. So should someone be exposed to pesticides in the air, that if there's an inhalation hazard, what is that first aid that we provide? It's essentially get them out of there, get them into some fresh air, get them breathing some fresh air, loosen their tight clothing, make it as easy as possible for them to breathe. If they're not breathing, well, now we need to call 911, start that CPR right away. Maybe you need to use a barrier, particularly if that you could be contaminated by that chemical as well. So that's the barrier that you would provide over their face when you're delivering those rescue breaths, the artificial respiration, and essentially you're getting help as soon as possible. So secondly, we're looking at eye exposure or ocular exposure. So again, eyes are really absorbent, and that not only can that we can get it absorbing into our bodies, essentially affecting our bloodstream, but it can also be corrosive and cause burning on the eyes themselves. So we might be looking at chemicals being accidentally sprayed or splashed into our eyes, but also just inadvertently if it's on our hands. Maybe we're rubbing our eyes and then we get it into our eyes that way. So definitely wear eye protection, follow whatever the label says, but in general, eyeglasses are not sufficient, but safety glasses may be if it's just for splashes. But again, that the smaller the droplet size, the greater the need for personal protective equipment. And maybe it's wearing goggles like that, or the full face goggles that give you really good protection. Also, just when you are measuring concentrates, do it below eye level. Don't kind of hold it up here trying to see if it's the right level, that you may inadvertently get it in your eyes. So what do we do then? Well, if someone were to get in their eyes, or yourself, make sure that you rinse your eyes for 15 minutes at least, like just get that continuous flushing, that dilution of the pesticide. And again, because it's so absorbent, it's not just the effects on the eyes, but the potential for absorption into your bloodstream. So you want to take that person to the hospital. Now we'll look at dermal exposure on the skin and hands. Again, that's going to be the most common route of entry. Usually, of course, it's on the exposed part. So we usually do a pretty good job of protecting the rest of our bodies, but often the forehands, or forehead, forearms, or the hands are often exposed. So wear the necessary personal protective equipment to completely cover you. Again, the highest risk is during mixing and loading. And that's when we work with the most concentrated product. And so once you have finished, doing your mixing and loading, wash your gloves off at that time as well. And then you can carry on with your spraying. But if you are, once you're changed at the end of the day and now you're handling your contaminated clothing, you may still want to be putting gloves back on to, put that contaminated clothing in a bag until you can take it somewhere and have it washed. So skin contamination, keep in mind, if somebody else is contaminated with this chemical, that you'll want to take necessary precautions to protect yourself before running over and washing them off. But really, it's dilution is what it's all about. Removing that contaminated clothing, washing, using soap and water and rinsing it off well. If there are burns, then you would need to cover it with a loose cool wet cloth and take them to the hospital. Again, they would need, there's the potential for absorption as well, as opposed to just the skin contamination. We can see other sort of internalized symptoms as well. So let's see. So another symptom or another possible way of ingesting or being exposed to pesticides is through ingestion. And so again, this can get into our bloodstream and it can be corrosive or cause burning, especially if they were to vomit it back up. So certainly in the event of an exposure, we only want to induce in vomiting if it is recommended on the label. But how they might get exposed is just by accident. They get, it's splashed or sprayed into the mouth by accident. Maybe a piece of equipment failed, but it could accidentally be consumed. A lot of the products we work with are they look like sports drinks. They could be yellow or blue or green or orange. There's all kinds of colors. Even this mix that I work with here, it looks like chocolate milk. So just making sure that it's kept away from anyone who might inadvertently consume it. And another way that happens is if people decant a chemical from the original storage container into a smaller storage container and don't adequately label it. So if someone does ingest pesticides, go to that label, read the label, see what it says to do. Certainly you can call poison control, and I've listed the 2 numbers here for Alberta is that 1-800-332-1414, or in BC that 1-800-567-8911. So they will have that information available to instruct you as to what should we do in this instance. Normally, inducing vomiting is not recommended. And so just don't do that unless told to do so by poison control or by a doctor. And so we go to the label, and most of the labels that I've read say do not induce vomiting. Sometimes they'll say give them sips of water. In particular, ester-based products or emulsifiable concentrates, they have petroleum distillates, and they are especially risky in that if you do ingest them, they'll say do not drink water, do not induce vomiting, and that it could be much worse if you were to do so. So just do what you're told to do with advice from a medical professional. So again, when you are going to the hospital, make sure you take the label with you or the SDS sheet with you. Maybe you have the apps on your phone, like have the labels on your phone. It does say, you can bring the jug with you. Would I? It wouldn't be my first choice, but you could if you had to. But at least having the PCP number is a key to accessing a lot more information about that product. So pesticide poisoning symptoms, of what does it look like? It varies. It varies for everybody. It really depends on the product, the formulation, the active ingredient, what sort of things that it does to the body. And that can be specific to that chemical. But in short, it could look like anything. It could look like food poisoning. It could look like someone has the flu and they're just not feeling good. And so if that's the case, certainly take a step away from spraying and go and get medical attention, or at least see if there is that link. Like if you're getting sick every time you go out spraying, then you may have a particular sensitivity to this chemical that maybe other people don't, and that you may have to wear a higher level of personal protective equipment. Certainly when we see more moderate symptoms of nausea, loss of coordination, tightness of throat, hard to breathe, or getting into vomiting, muscle trembling, that sort of thing. Now, these are serious symptoms, and that's an emergency trip to the hospital. So which is the most common route of exposure? Inhalation, ocular, ingestion, or dermal? The most common route. Answer that at the end of the class, not now. So personal protective equipment, what should we be wearing? Well, it depends on what kind of exposure you have. Like I've had to spray where I'm spraying like pesticide up into the trees and it's like pouring down on me. So when it's that sort of situation, it's going to be the extreme level of personal protective equipment. I had a full suit and, full respirator, face mask, rain hat, full rain suit. So, I mean, that was over the top, but it was required because of my level of exposure. Normally, it may just be very straightforward. It's whatever the label says is the minimum level. So it may just be long sleeve shirt, long pants, socks, rubber boots and gloves and glasses, that kind of thing. Depends on that formulation as well. Like, are we dealing with dust or powders, or are they soluble? Are they vapors? What is that formulation? And that route of entry what is the biggest risk to us? Is it through inhalation? Is it a very fine droplet size? And therefore we need to wear a respirator. So just do whatever is required according to that label. And that's a consideration as far as how you're applying it. So that application method. And again, that toxicity on the label. Where do we go to find out how toxic a product is? We're going to the label, and it will tell us not only how toxic it is, but what personal protective equipment we should be wearing. So on that note, then we're looking at some of these different types of equipment that you should consider. So when it comes to footwear, it should be chemically resistant footwear, but I mean, a good old rubber boot is satisfactory. And then especially, it's just don't be wearing running shoes or leather shoes, certainly anything that is going to hold that pesticide. So and then you'd have repeat exposure to it. So at least with our rubber boots, we have full protection and we're able to wash them. When it comes to body coverings, then I like to have that extra level of protection. So, I mean, I have my regular clothes that I would be wearing, but then I have a pair of coveralls on. So that may depend on the field that you're working in. Like when I'm working in the oil field, of course, I need my fire resistant coveralls. I need the reflective stripes. But even so, I even have some here. So, okay, so these you're familiar with, the blue coveralls with reflective stripes. That would be sort of my oil field wear. Now, keeping in mind, it's a level of protection in terms of it gives you that extra buffer, but it's not waterproof by any means. And so you do have to change them and wash them every day. Now, the other ones you might be familiar with are these white Tyvek suits. You're probably still sweating. They're very sweaty because they do have that level of water protection, like not 100%, but they're not very breathable. The good thing about them, though, is that I do like the elastic cuffs and the elastic around the ankles as well. And they actually have like elastic around the head as well, if you're wearing that full protection. So, and they're disposable. So they're good in that sense that you're not worrying about washing them every time. They are disposable. And so when I work with insecticides, especially, I'll just toss those when I'm done because I don't like, I don't want to have a risk of additional exposure. And then aprons, sometimes you need an extra level of precaution. And that's where like you have this full apron. I won't be able to show you so good, but it's like a thick rubber, thick vinyl, kind of full body front protection, and that might be just when you're doing like mixing and loading when there's a high level of exposure. When it comes to gloves, you may just use they'll say just use chemically resistant gloves, not gardening gloves, not dishwashing gloves, not leather gloves, but something like these neoprene or nitrile gloves. I tend to use these ones that are just easy to use, and they are just disposable. So I replace them several times within the day. The other ones are fine. You can wash them regularly as well to keep them clean. When it comes to head covering, you may need, it depends on the workplace where you're at, of what sort of head covering you need. But if you do, having the hard hat with the brim that allows for it to drip off versus sort of the baseball cap type style of head covering. And again, those white Tyvek suits have the full head covering. So it sort of, again, depends on the type of spraying that you're doing. And then eye protection. So eye protection, again, it depends on what you're spraying, the droplet size, and the risk to, and what the label says. So it may just be that you can get away with just a regular set of safety glasses that have sort of the side protection, and they have some splash protection. What they don't have is protection for sort of vapors and that sort of thing. And so if you're working with vapors, and especially if you need to wear a respirator as well, I would just get the full face mask. Is that the respirator combined with that full eye protection? The other ones are like your grade 7 goggles, right? These are good. These are quite good actually in terms of having that higher level of protection. And so they are true goggles versus just safety glasses. Now people say, well, I have my my regular glasses, I can't wear safety glasses. Well, you can, because you could wear these funky ones that actually fit over top of your regular glasses, and they'll provide you with that extra level of control. And then when we get to respirators, again, it depends whether the label tells you to wear them. And some people just choose to wear them. They just say, you know what, I don't want to take any risk with this. I'm going to wear them. So this is like a half piece respirator or half mask respirator. And so when you use one, make sure that it is made to fit you properly. They come in like small, medium, large, extra large, that sort of thing. And also make sure that the cartridges that you use are organic vapor cartridges or are appropriate for the chemical that you're using, and that they are compatible with the face mask. So this is a Honeywell face mask. It's got Honeywell cartridges with it. So when you do store them, we would remove those cartridges at the end of every day. We store them in a separate plastic bag because otherwise they continue to absorb pesticides. And then we would wash all these things. So at the end of every day, we need to be washing our personal protective equipment, including that, including the face mask, the goggles, all your protective wear. So we're washing at the end of every day. We're removing those cartridges, storing store them away. Plastic and things, we store them away from sunlight. But our coveralls, it's actually nice to wash them away from your household laundry. Don't wash them with your family's, the rest of the family's clothes, but on high level of hot water, lots of soap, and then hang them outside to dry in the sunlight. The sun will help to break down that pesticide. If you, or any remaining pesticide in those coveralls, if they are truly soaked in chemical, you have to toss them. There's just no way to adequately clean them, and you run the risk of diluting that pesticide into your wash water and having it drain out into your municipal wastewater system. So if you can't wash them right away, put them in a plastic bag and until you can wash them. So another question for you: pesticide handlers must clean their work clothes separate from the family laundry to prevent pesticide contamination. Is that true or false? Well, yeah, that would be true. We don't want any contaminants with our family's clothing. So then we look at lastly about the emergency response plan. Is that, remember we started this about talking about hazard assessments. So this is part of that, in that we've recognized that the exposure to pesticide is one of the hazards. And so we're going to look at the label, look at the SDS sheet, see what we need to have in place in terms of necessary spill cleanup equipment, and even some like what sort of absorbance we need, what sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, but the counter chemical, how to dilute it. and then what personal protective equipment you need to have in your emergency kit. And then also having a list of contact numbers, whether it's the poison, you'd want that poison control number, who to call in case of a spill, who do we call in case of a fire. All these things need to be addressed in your emergency response plan. And then everyone who's affected by the plan needs to take part in that. So one of those things is going to be medical emergencies. And so this is where I just encourage you to take your first aid training. Make sure that everybody has it. At least one person by legislation has to have it at the workplace. But again, the more people that have it, the better. Ultimately, you need to protect yourself first in the event of that you need to provide first aid, stop the exposure, use water where that's appropriate, and follow those label instructions. And again, that PCP number, bringing the label with you is super critical. So in your first aid kit, sometimes there's a few things that you need that are a little bit different than just the regular supplies in the first aid kit. So just making sure that you do have extra pairs of gloves and that you have an extra source of water. I've been at some job sites where they've said, where is your extra water? Like that could be used for washing, that could be used for drinking. If the label says give somebody a sip of water to drink, do you have clean water for them to drink? And so make sure you have extra water available for washing, not just a big tank of mixed pesticide without having a clean water source. And then maybe you'll need a barrier device for doing rescue breaths when you're doing CPR. So that might be something that go ahead and check your first aid kit. Make sure that that is something that's available. Also, I just add this with caution, but sometimes in the old first aid kits, they used to have activated charcoal, and that was for the purpose of giving to somebody in order that it would absorb pesticides in their stomach. We don't find activated charcoal in the first aid kits anymore. But if in reading your labels and your SDS sheets that it recommends something like that, then maybe that is something that you want to have available. Of course, you wouldn't give it to anyone. Certainly you wouldn't give it to anyone without medical advice, and certainly they would need to be conscious to do such a thing. And then having plastic bag for vomit, maybe that's not something that you have in your first aid kit now. Maybe having a blanket to cover someone to reduce the potential for shock, and have your emergency phone numbers available. So just essentially, I'm just concluding it with make sure that you're prepared. Take the necessary training and know where are your applicators working? What are they spraying with? When do we expect them to return that day? Know what it would look like. What are those symptoms of pesticide poisoning? Like, was someone poisoned during the day and that they just say, no, I just don't really feel very good. But you could say, you know what, I think you could be having symptoms. You know, these are classic potential effects from exposure to that pesticide. I think we better get you checked out. So don't be afraid to intervene and encourage someone to get medical help. So that's that acute exposure, and know your first aid for that. Yes, this is just just an awareness that do take the necessary precautions and the necessary training to make sure that you can provide first aid if needed. So emergency numbers that you might have on hand would be like, again, in Alberta, that poison control number, the 332-1414, or for in BC, that 1-800-567-8911. And then the emergency response, just 911, which thankfully is applicable in most places. I just hazard that in that sometimes I've had to work in the middle of nowhere, and recognizing that sometimes you're so far away and so remote, an ambulance is not coming. And so you need to know as part of your hazard assessment that is not an option for you. And you may need to know the STARS phone number, or what your STARS site is, or what the numbers are for medevac options. So usually that can be done through calling 911, but it's something that it's good to know in advance. So yeah, essentially always seek medical attention if symptoms appear following a pesticide exposure. Don't wait, because it really is a risk. Basically, through Health Canada, they have approved all of these products as being safe to use. The key there is you must wear the personal protective equipment and work with them safely. So that brings it to a conclusion a little bit early, but that does give us time to just chat a little bit So thank you so much for your time, and I'll take some questions. Hi, Fiona.
Hi, Lisa. That was excellent. Thank you very much. You're truly an expert in your field. That was incredible. You had me reflecting a little bit that you had a couple of reminders in there. But while it is the employer's responsibility to ensure that everybody has the proper gear and proper first aid training, I think you would agree it's also important to remember to always advocate for yourself and others on your team.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a good point, because I have seen that where there is somebody who is having just more exposure effects than other people in the group. And they felt like they couldn't say anything because no one else was experiencing the same things, but it was every time they're going out. And so at the end of the day, they were provided with a full face mask and respirator, and they continued to work in that environment, and they were fine once they were adequately protected. It can also be the opportunity to say this particular application doesn't work for me and I can't do this. But essentially, that was identified, and they had a supervisor that was able to address that and provide them with the extra protection. And I know some other companies that they just say, okay, that's minimum on the label. We are putting everybody in full suits, full respirators. We're just going to take that off the table as being a risk and just go for the full protection.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just safety first always. And we know that. And also at the end of the day, like, it is your life and your health. And while this is important work being done, obviously we are all, safety is the most important. Just a reminder to everybody that you can pop your questions into the Q&A box. We do have a little bit of time to answer them. So we have our first question here, Elisa. Do you recommend a respirator for glyphosate or aminopyrrolate?
Okay.
Not required on the label, but asking if Canadians generally do. I know it's a balance of not scaring the public, but you need to watch out for yourself as well.
Oh boy, that's such a good one, because yeah, at minimum, we do what the label says, and the label does not say you need to wear a respirator. I totally understand that um, that decision where it's like the public, you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, like where they say you should be wearing a respirator. And it's like, you can say back to them, we are required legally to wear what is listed on the label. However, so that's at the minimum level. Some people will choose to wear the full respirator just to reduce that level of exposure. And then people are looking at them like, if you're wearing all that and I'm walking over here with my dog and my child, what sort of level of risk is there to me? And so I've seen it both ways. Honestly, I don't even have a really good answer for you. I do trust Health Canada and the recommendations, but I do also recognize that if you're having symptoms, if your eyes are getting irritated, if you are having any symptoms that you feel need an extra level of protection, certainly take those extra precautions. And many people just do. They just wear a respirator because the level of exposure day after day after day, even if it's slight, is still a higher risk than someone who uses it once or twice a year.
Totally. Sorry, everyone, I lost my train of thought there, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you do have to take the quiz, and I just popped the link in the survey for you all to take it. Our next question, or not a question, but an ask. Do you have tips and intervals of respirator and cartridge cleaning? What are best
Good
practices?
one. Yeah, my apologies. I should have touched on that. I have good news and bad news in terms of the easy answer is follow the manufacturer's instructions, whatever they tell you to do. But usually they say 8 hours of continuous wear is a good sort of something to follow, that it may be every day. If you're certainly working with insecticides, you're doing that all day long, then you would want to change them every day. The short answer is if at any time you can smell or taste the product, then those cartridges either are no longer working and they're saturated, or that mask isn't fitting and you're drawing in air from somewhere else. Some people could get away with changing them once a week. And so it really depends on the duration of wear, or duration, like, yeah, how long you're wearing it, and what pesticides you're being exposed to and that level of risk. But certainly if the cartridges are damaged, if they get wet, if you can smell or taste anything, it's an immediate change out.
The next question is something that I had been wondering about during your presentation. If you are in full PPE with a respirator and Tyvek suit, and it's very hot, we know in the interior of British Columbia, and the heat domes that we experienced last year, you're more at risk for overheating than possibly the pest? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And I've seen that happen. And so, okay, so there's a lot of different things working sort of in your favor in that the label may say, do not apply this pesticide over 27 degrees Celsius. So you may be off the hook right there. It's bringing the crews back in, it's over 27. Otherwise, sometimes just you may have a separate safe work practice where it says anything over 30 degrees, we're only going to let our workers work for 45 minutes at a time and take a necessary 15-minute break of every hour to keep them out of the heat, necessary, to get them into the shade and get them drinking water at least 15 minutes of every hour. But it would be something where I would maybe choose not to wear the Tyvek suit and switch to some cotton coveralls, something that's a little more breathable. Like even on a cooler day, those are pretty darn stuffy. So just keep that in mind. There are other options available to you, maybe using, like I say, cotton coveralls instead of that, the Tyvek suits in particular. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's a good segue to another question. What material do you recommend in clothes? You just mentioned cotton. I have heard cotton is common, but more absorbent than polyesters. Also prefer quick dry, cooler, lighter, and easier washing synthetic fibers. Yet cotton does seem to be the most commonly recommended fabric.
Certainly. Like I think even these ones I have are just a cotton polyester. And yeah, I prefer those lighter weight ones. It depends kind of what temperature that you're working in. So I'm probably not authorized to, advise one way or the other as far as we recognize that these are not waterproof by any means. These are strictly an additional layer of protection that we know that they can absorb pesticides. And as a result, we do need to keep them clean, remove them quickly after exposure. But if you're doing a type of exposure where you're getting wet, you do need that higher level of sort of a water protection, including you could even wear like a rain suit. Like I say, I've had to do it myself. Just so yeah, I'm fine with a cotton poly blend and something that washes and dries easily. The true cotton ones are probably just a little too thick and a little too absorbent, is my thought.
That's great. Well, thank you, Lisa. I'm going to see if Gwen is around to jump back on for final comments. That was excellent. There's Gwen. And Gwen, I just want to bring your attention to a question maybe you can answer. Is someone's asking, the quiz is asking for their pesticide applicator certificate number. Where can you find that?
You need to apply through the Ministry of Environment. So, and in order to get your applicator certificate, initially you need to write the exam. So you need to apply through Ministry of Environment, you need to write and pass the exam. And once you have, and then they will supply you with an applicator certificate. Once you have that certificate, you can keep it current and you can keep using it through the continuing education program. So you need to take 20 hours of credits of training over 5 years, and you can keep your applicator certificate current without rewriting the exam. All the information on the program is available on the IVMA website at ivma.com. And with that, I guess we're close to 1 hour. So, and I don't see many other questions. So Lisa, thank you so much. That's a very, I know it's not an overly kind of inspired, it's not a lot of fun, this topic, and you made a really good job of presenting some material that's quite difficult to present. So thank you so much. That was excellent.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. All the best to everybody today. Work safe.
Work
All right.
safe. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, welcome. Bye now.
Bye.